To discuss what all of this means, I'm delighted to be joined now by Michael Fabricant, the Conservative MP for Lichfield. And Michael, I just want to start off. I mean, if we were going by Twitter, the whole country's supposed to be appalled that the Prime Minister's taken a week off. What on earth's going on?
Never believe Twitter. That's what's going on. But it's not just the YouGov poll, but other polls as well, all saying the same thing, that the lead is widening between the Conservative Party and Labour. I think one of the problems that Labour has got, and then I'll soon say what I think the great thing that the Conservatives have got, but one of the problems that Labour has got is that they are losing votes to the SNP. Previously, there were many, many Labour MPs in Scotland. They are losing votes to Plaid Cymru in Wales, to the Green Party, to the Lib Dems. They're taking more from Labour than they are from the Conservatives. But the key thing is, I think despite the press going on and on and on about Boris's holiday, I think the vast majority of the population really don't care too much about it. They understand that sometime the Prime Minister has got to take a holiday. Parliament's in recess. He's just had a big conference. He's directing things. I was WhatsApping with the PM only 2 days ago, so I know he's in full contact with everyone, not just me, but also the ministers. And he's getting on with it, and that's the point. I think Boris is our great asset because he's such a visionary, because we're getting this Northern Ireland situation done. It looks as if there's been a huge concession coming through from Europe, and people just see that.
To see that Number 10 has clearly been a little bit worried about the holiday situation. I've had my inbox completely full of emails saying the Prime Minister's just got off the phone with the Egyptian Prime Minister or the Turkish President or whoever he happens to be talking to. I think he's doing more ring rounds of international leaders on this holiday than he normally does within Number 10. But you mentioned that poll position seems to be growing. We can bring you a polling average now on our screens that shows the polling average over the last few years, and we can see that over the last August, over the last summer, when and particularly going into sort of our second and third lockdowns, there was a bit of convergence in the polls there. But since then, things spread out of touch. And you can see there, this is actually from a few days ago, just a 34 to 40 gap. Well, now on YouGov, a 10-point gap. Clearly a growing distance again between the Conservatives and the Labour Party. And what's very interesting to me about this is if we compare this to previous governments, Margaret Thatcher would say that she wasn't governing well enough unless she was a bit behind in the polls. Ed Miliband was ahead of the coalition, was ahead of the Conservative Party and well ahead of the Lib Dems in the polls for much of that 2010 to 15 Parliament. So I wonder, actually, is the Conservative Party perhaps too far ahead in the polls? Does this mean it's not doing enough, not wanting to take those big, difficult decisions that might risk it being unpopular, if only for a bit?
Well, you're tempting me, Tom, because I remember years ago, under Margaret Thatcher, government minister, I've forgotten his name, but you probably can remember, said, oh, the next election, I don't want us to do well because it'll make us complacent. Listen, there's nothing wrong with having a nice big lead. But I think it's because not that we're doing everything comfortably, not that we're not doing things that need change. I think it is because Boris is leading a radical government, making the huge changes. We got Brexit done. Now we're making Brexit even better, sorting out Northern Ireland. And as I say, there's so much else going on too. There's been a growing problem over the last 2 years about, for example, today, about access to GPs. And we hear today that that is being addressed. So it's hardly a government sitting on its laurels.
I'd put it to you that potentially the Conservative Party stayed relatively stable, up a couple points maybe, but relatively stable for quite a long time. It's the Labour Party that seems to have fallen down. And interestingly, in that YouGov poll, the Greens doing a bit better. I wonder, and I was at the Labour Party conference in Brighton just a couple of weeks ago, where Keir Starmer took on his left. Oh, it was a great fun affair. Where Keir Starmer took on his left, was heckled by many members of his parliament during his speech, by members of his party, I should say. And it seems to be that the Labour Party may well be losing votes, not winning them from the right, but also losing them from the left. I want to show you a front page of a local newspaper in Camden just this week. Defection shock. In fact, this is the deputy leader of Camden Council, a Labour politician, a Labour councillor in Keir Starmer's own backyard. Of course, this is an area which Keir Starmer partly represents as an MP. And the deputy leader of the council has defected from the Labour Party to the Greens. I wonder, Michael, if this is happening in Keir Starmer's own backyard, does the Labour Party have an issue with seeping votes to their left?
Yeah, well, friends of mine actually did attend the Labour Party conference, like you, Tom, and they were saying that, it was just absolutely awful, the atmosphere. They were saying, because they also went to the Conservative, well, actually, two of them didn't go to the Conservative conference because they caught COVID in Brighton at the Labour Party conference. I hope you didn't get it. Well, obviously not, because you wouldn't be here now. But
things to say about Brighton. It was interesting. There were signs all over the walls saying "Wear your mask." There were signs saying "You please, you're advised, you're expected to wear your mask in these zones." And then you had all of these Labour MPs who wear masks in Parliament. Absolutely none of them were wearing masks, particularly when they were singing in each other's faces in the karaoke in the evenings.
Yeah, incredible hypocrites, actually. I mean, just trying to score points in the House of Commons chamber. But, the average age, too, at the Labour Party conference, I would say, was some 15 to 20 years younger. Sorry, older. It always used to be the other way. It always used to be that Labour Party delegates were a lot younger than the Blue Rinse Brigade. We used to talk about the people who went along to the Conservative conferences. But I have to say, I mean, boy, it was a hell of a young... I didn't see you, by the way, Tom. I came onto your stand several times looking for you. And they said you were either
too busy
asleep.
collecting stories, Michael. Too busy working.
Of course.
But it is interesting. It is right you flagged this. The Conservative Party conference, I believe it was their youngest conference they've ever held in terms of average ages. But it also felt a bit low-key, a bit low energy. The Labour Party, lots of stories, lots of excitement. Maybe not all of it good for the Labour Party, but certainly there was energy, there was passion there. Are the Conservative Party slightly complacent? No big announcements in Boris Johnson's speech, no sort of energy on the floor that you might feel in the run-up to an election. Just a very boring conference. Clearly what Number 10 was aiming for, but is it what's right for the Conservative Party right now?
Well, let me tell you, I first went to a party conference, Conservative Party conference, in Brighton years ago, and I found it the most boring affair. And I remember a government minister, I think it was John Knott actually, came up to me. He was a defence minister at the time of the Falklands. And he came up to me and he sort of knew me somehow. And this was long before I became an MP, and said, are you enjoying the conference? And I said, well, not really. And he said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm just sitting and watching all the speeches. And they're a bit repetitive, And he said, look, you were brought up in America, which I was. And he said, treat it like an American convention. And the point I'm making, Tom, is you're right. It was rather dull. It was no surprises in the hall. And there wasn't a huge buzz around the exhibition stands, apart from the stand for GB News. But, and this is the big but, I went to most of the fringe events and they were packed out, they were exciting, there were some arguments, and they were lively. And really, that's where party conferences go on, in the fringe. It's like the Edinburgh Fringe. Who actually remembers the main Edinburgh Festival? It's the fringe that actually is where it all happens. And that's where it was all happening in Manchester just a week or so ago.
I'd agree with you there. Interestingly, though, many of those fringes were not holding back on their criticism of government policy, particularly this government becoming a high-taxing government, the highest tax burden for over half a century, both raising taxes on employer contribution NI, on employee contribution NI, and corporation tax as well. This from a party that under George Osborne used to say, we cut corporation tax and they brought in more revenue. Now they seem to have thrown that logic out of the window. Is there a worry here that all of the excitement is going on with the people who disagree with Conservative policy at the moment?
They weren't all disagreeing, Tom. A lot of them were very for the thing. But, I think people accept we've spent 400 billion pounds. I repeat that, 400, in fact, it's more than that. It's about 450 billion pounds during the whole COVID crisis so far. And, you know, the money doesn't come from trees, it's got to be recovered. And it's being recovered. But, you know, I don't think anybody doubts we want to be a low tax economy. And because of that, Britain in the past, and still incidentally, is attracting more inward investment than all the other EU countries on continental Europe combined. Now, that won't continue if we are a very, very high tax country. But, you know, Rishi came to Lichfield. I'm the Member of Parliament for Lichfield, and came to Lichfield about 2 or 3 weeks ago for our annual supper. And he was saying, you know, that he regrets doing it. The Treasury regrets doing it, but it's got to be done. And, you know, there will be a period not too long from now, I suspect, when we can ease off on the taxation.
That the Chancellor would say to your local party that he regrets those tax rises because, of course, he seems to be defending them so vociferously in public. And given the logic there, it does seem a bit of a mismatch here in terms of the logic. The Conservative Party used to say cut taxes can actually bring in more revenue. Potentially, the way to pay for that £400 billion of borrowing may well be to spur economic growth by cutting taxes, by easing the burden on businesses. That could well bring in more revenue. My point here is that logic seems to have now been abandoned by this government as it scrabbles to go after what it perceives to be a sort of economic centre ground.
Well, that's an interesting argument, Tom, and it was one that was used by Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Margaret Thatcher, way back, when was it, 1970, when she got in? 1979, rather, when she got in. Taxes were up at about 98% in the pound for unearned income under the Labour government. And of course, it resulted in a huge brain drain, obviously enough, people going to other countries because they wouldn't be taxed so punitively as at 98%. It also meant that countries didn't want to invest in the UK because of high taxation, not just income tax, but corporation tax too. But we're not talking about levels anything like that at the moment. And I think the problem is that if we don't tax, if we don't try and recover some of that £450 billion debt, then we are going to find ourselves in big doo-doos and people are not going to invest in the UK. The pound will sink against other currencies. We've got to show that we've got a grip on the economy. And one of the things that I like to think most Conservative governments have got is a pretty strong grip on the currencies. And, you know, we started off this section of your show talking about the YouGov polling, and we're talking about who would vote for who if there were an election tomorrow. More revealingly, they have asked other questions too, like who would make the better Prime Minister, Boris or Keir Starmer? And who would run the economy better, the Conservatives or Labour? And on both those scores, again, the Conservatives are way ahead. So, yeah, you're right. Of course, everyone wants low taxes, especially me as a Conservative MP. But I think people realise, and the population realise, that, you know, we've got to somehow recover some of that 450 billion.
Well, let's hope that the Conservatives can live back up to their tax-cutting credentials before the next election. Michael Fabricant, thank you so much for that very interesting conversation, a wide-ranging conversation and an interesting one, especially as there may be 1 or 2 by-elections coming up in the near future. Michael, thank you for joining us on The Briefing this afternoon.